Public lands in the West contain resources. These lands, which cover a span from craggy mountain peaks to forest-covered valleys to the open plains, are managed by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Most of the resources found on these lands are obvious. There is another important resource that is more subtle. It is faded by time and obscured by layers of earth. Faint fragments are often the only tangible evidence. However, these fragments tell a fascinating story. The story of human history. The human history is often overlooked, but it is no less significant than the more tangible resources. The study of human or cultural history is called archaeology, and it is a fairly recent addition to the management disciplines of the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service. Dr. Tom Roll is a professor of anthropology at Montana State University. In the following segments, he explains what archaeology is, the methods used by archaeologists to interpret human history, and the vital role archaeology plays in helping to understand the past to better guide the future.
When I'm out in the field working, people frequently ask me, "What's this rock?" Or, "Hey, I found an old dinosaur bone." And then they're startled when I say, "Gee, I wish I could help you out, but I've got a buddy at school that can teach you those things. I don't know very much about them." Now, archaeologists, paleontologists, and geologists all share a lot of information. Let's take a brief look at time and see if we can't get some understanding for the kind of time scale that geologists, paleontologists, and archaeologists work in. By our best estimates right now, the world is about 4.6 billion years old. Now that's a bunch of time. If we sit down here and take a look at this, we can draw a line that starts here, right at the very bottom. And we'll run it up to the top of the board. And we're going to say that this is 4.6 billion years right here. And this little gap right at the top is going to be about the last million years. And I'll move that over here in just a bit. Okay, now we start off down here at 4.6 million years ago. And we can move up to around 575 million years ago for a period of time that's called the Precambrian. Okay, now what we're talking about here is the time during which the very earliest exist. Things like blue-green algae, a variety of little things, but really there wasn't very much in the way of life forms. Now, this runs from, then we start here with a series of life intervals. We talk about them as being the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Okay, the Paleozoic consists of very primitive animal forms. And those primitive animal forms continued till about 220 million years ago, give or take a bit. Okay, then from there up to about 65 million years ago is the period of time we talk about as being the Mesozoic. And the Mesozoic is when many of the life forms that we recognize today, the vertebrates and more advanced animals, start to appear. And it's during the very last portion of the Mesozoic that the dinosaurs come into existence. Now, many paleontologists focus very heavily on this interval of time. That's where they're most interested. Okay? Some of them continue on to the Cenozoic. And the Cenozoic, really, it's this boundary right here between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic, this one right about there, that we see the first of the mammals coming into existence. We start seeing a few primates, very primitive primates. One of them comes from a site in Montana over in this area, a little fellow by the name of Purgatorius. And this is one of the very first of the human ancestors. Okay, now, the things that we would identify as being erect bipeds, things that are, with very little question, human ancestors, start at about 5 million years ago. Now, this is when archaeologists start really getting interested, because archaeologists don't focus so much on pre-human things as they do humans and their immediate ancestors. Now, that means then that we're going to be interested in just the very last portion of the Cenozoic. The geologist is interested in the construction of the earth. The paleontologist is interested in the animals that start occupying the earth and the times when they do so. And the archaeologist is interested in humans and their time on earth. And in particular, we're interested in human culture. That is, how humans manage to earn a living in the environment they find themselves in. Now, this is a real interesting sort of thing for us to deal with, because we've got a lot of time to work in. So let's start over here with another line. We're going to run a line up starting at about 3.5 million years with the first humans. Okay, there we are. We're going to run this up like this, and we're going to take a look at what we've got for humans and how they manage to earn a living. Now, back beyond this, it would appear that most of the bipedal human-like things were earning a living principally by just scavenging. And that may have continued up to about 1.5 million years ago, and possibly longer yet. But we start seeing tools appearing. We start seeing a lot of use of animals. Now, if we take this chart and continue up, we're going to find that at about 10,000 years ago, the whole world was filled with people. People began, it appears, in Africa and slowly expanded outward. And by 10,000 years ago, there were just a very few places left that humans hadn't moved into. The first humans entered the New World sometime before 13,000 years ago, very shortly before 13,000 probably. And so they occupied that. This radiation of humanity created some particular situations. Now, in certain portions of the world, by 10,000 years ago, there were enough people living in the world that they simply had to come up with a new way of earning a living. And so they started scouting around for new exercises. And by about 8,000 years ago in the Near East, we have our first instance of people who have deliberately modified plants and animals sufficiently that we can identify them as having been domesticated. So let's put ourselves a 10,000 year timeline up here. This is 10,000. And we're going to go up to the present. We have people all over the world. Australia's been occupied, Europe's been occupied, Asia, the New World, both North and South America. And we're starting to see occupation of island chains. Hawaii hasn't been occupied yet, but we have people moving out there. And in the New World, at about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, we see people invent this process called agriculture a second time in the New World. Okay, now, by and large, the people of the world, up until 10,000 years ago, earned their living by hunting and gathering. In the New World, that continued every place until about 5,000 years ago. And in the principal region of our concern, that is the northwestern United States, people were earning a living by hunting and gathering, principally, until the time of Lewis and Clark, and even for a short time thereafter.
Even though the hunting and gathering culture of this area is fairly recent, the clues for understanding and interpreting it are often difficult to find. Archaeologists use a variety of tools and methods to interpret cultural history. In some cases, conclusions can be confirmed by experiment. For example, archaeologists have learned a great deal about how stone tools were made by actually replicating the techniques. Here, an archaeologist demonstrates the difficult and complex process of making a stone projectile point. He's creating a point similar to the ones used 11,000 years ago to kill a now extinct form of elephant. These points had the distinctive feature of a long thinning flake driven along the axis of the point. This allowed the point to be securely fastened to a shaft. The thinning flake is difficult to do, and a mistake can easily result in a broken point. In this case, the archaeologist is completely successful. While a thinning flake results from painstaking work, successfully interpreting prehistoric culture mostly results from painstaking analysis. As Dr. Roll explains in the next segment, archaeologists focus on the three distinct features of time, space, and form.
Archaeologists work with a lot of different materials, and one of the things that we have to deal with is the idea of time. Time is really important to us, but it's not the only thing we work with. We work with space, that is the geographic distribution of things where they occur, and we deal with the formal attributes, that is what things look like that we find. Let's start by taking a little bit deeper look at time and the way we can deal with time in different ways. Now, for a long time we've known that if we excavate an archaeological site, let's say that this is the surface, we've got a few pieces of grass growing here, things, and we dig a hole down here, that those things which occur here will generally be associated with things in this stratum and will be more recent than those things which lie in a stratum. Let's say we have a bone bed lying down below. Okay, so we can talk about relative time. This is older than this. Now, for a long time, archaeologists operated exclusively with relative time. This is older than that. And we had no way of arriving at more precise measurements of that. More recently, we've developed a variety of mechanisms. One of the earliest of these was a thing called dendrochronology. It's simply the counting of tree rings. And by looking at tree rings through time, we can get an idea of actual time, absolute time, rather than relative time. One of the methods we're using a great deal today is one called radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating provides us with an absolute measurement of time. Now, that's not to say that radiocarbon dates can't be wrong, or that they don't have a measurement of error, an element of error. They do. But the real key is that they are absolute in the sense that we can trace what we're working with to those time intervals, rather than saying later than or earlier than. Now, time is not the only thing that archaeologists have to work with. Space becomes a very important attribute of artifacts and of things. For example, we've already talked about this region, and we note that over here people were agriculturalists or raising crops. Okay, they lived in permanent villages. All of these things dictate certain kinds of things about them. We don't find very much. We find a little trickling of agricultural-like things coming down the Yellowstone River. A few bits of pottery. Maybe an earth lodge village near Glendive. Things of that sort. Over here we can look and we find that in northern Idaho, that is in the southern portion of this area right here. We do have permanent village life dependent upon salmon. Okay, we can predict certain things from that. Okay, here we don't see those kinds of things. All right, the spatial distribution of these elements is important to our understanding. Now, in addition to that, we can look at formal attributes. Let's, for example, take a couple of projectile points. Here we have then two projectile points that were in existence at approximately the same time. The actual date on this particular projectile point is around 2100 years ago, that is 600 later, but we do have them overlapping totally in time from both locations. These seem to be from a very limited area in southeastern Montana, northern Wyoming, portions of North Dakota and South Dakota, but very limited in their distribution. The other type seems to be more generalized and is more widely distributed.
Most of the clues archaeologists need to understand human culture are buried in the earth and fragmented by the elements. These artifacts left by bygone eras must be found and carefully analyzed to understand how cultures functioned. Dr. Roll and his crew are excavating a bison kill site near Glendive, Montana. By studying the characteristics of time, space, and form, they are able to understand and interpret how early people used the site and how they survived.
What we want to find out in terms of the scientific evidence in the site is what kind of a site it was. We know it's a bison kill, but how did it occur? There's a possibility that bison were run in from the north down over the drop and dropped in, but that seems pretty unlikely given what we see now. And more than likely this was a sandstone box canyon that was used to trap the bison. Probably down below us here someplace they had some kind of a barricade that trapped the bison into this locality, and then they dispatched them. Since that time, if my argument's correct, gumbo has been washed off from the hills to the north of us and to the east of us here and filled this coulee in, completely filled in the coulee, and left the bison bone in place. Then, sometime later, erosion started and exposed the bison bone. From what we know about the site, it was probably occupied sometime between about 3,000 years ago and 1,500 years ago. That's based on the projectile point forms that we're finding here, the types of points that we see. So we're getting a pretty good idea from that. The other thing that we need to find out is if there's more than one event. And right now it looks as though there are at least two separate strata or two separate bone beds. So there may be two and possibly even more occupations than what we thought we'd see. Right now it looks like we have at least three different species of animals represented in the site. There are bison bone. Over in the square over there where the fellow's working, we found what looks like the heel bone of a dog or wolf. Certainly it's a canid of some sort. And then up where the other fellow's working there, we have what looks like the foot bone from an elk. So we're getting what looks like some species diversity. And then a little further over, we found a very small bone that looks like it's fetal. An animal was shortly before it was born. And so from that, then we can also get an idea of seasonality. So there are a whole series of things we can do with the bones that'll give us a lot of information. We can say, one, what kind of a herd it was. Was it a cow-calf herd? Was it a bull herd? If we have cow-calf herds with bull herds, we know, that is, we have all of the animals represented. We know it's a particular time of year because that's the only time that those animals come together in large quantities. If it's strictly a cow herd, we can pretty well guess that it's probably spring. And so we can get a lot of idea of what's going on there. Then when the fetal remains, we know that the fetal bones have to be sometime between December and May. And so we can get an idea of the season of the site from that. So there's a lot we can learn from the site. Then in addition to that, we find that the tooth wear patterns on the animals gives us a lot of information about how old the herd is and how stressed it's been. If you see young animals that have a lot of tooth wear, that means they're having to graze under very difficult conditions. So we can then say, okay, the animals weren't in very good shape, therefore the Indians had to take more or fewer of the animals. So there's a lot we can learn from that. And now we're getting to some really exotic stuff, like analyzing the bone to find out what kind of forage they were getting. Whether or not it's one particular kind of grass or another particular kind of grass tells us a lot about the nature of the environment in the area. So it's getting to the point that we can get an awful lot of information, and of course every time we do a project like this we come up with new ideas on how to tackle the problems that we're facing. In this instance, the people were pretty straightforwardly hunters and gatherers. They hunted animals, largely bison, and gathered a wide range of fruits, berries, and tubers that are available in this area, and probably even use some grains, although we have very weak evidence for that at this time. So we assume that they were relatively migratory people that living in relatively small bands. They're coming to a place, a particular place, because they know that animals are going to be available in large abundance off downstream in the river bottoms. And they know that certain kinds of patterns that the animals follow are very predictable. So they're coming to this location because they know they can bring the animals in here and kill them reliably and gain substantial quantities of food for the following months that they're facing. So I think we often think of hunters as being a bunch of men going out hunting, but that's not the way these people operated, I don't suspect. I would think that here we have family groups living in the area and operating as a communal body that is enhancing their survival capacity by cooperation. These kinds of insights into the hunting and gathering lifeway are really important to us. Because remember, when we started out, we said that human beings have been on the earth for about 3.5, 4 million years. They have spent most of their time, 99.9% of that time on earth, have been as hunters and gatherers. This laboratory of the northwestern United States is one of the most recent places that hunters and gatherers lived. Archaeologists have a lot of diverse interests. We're interested in how people survived. We're interested in the kinds of change in climate that affected their survival. We're interested in a whole variety of things. We're interested in the way archaeological sites are distributed over the landscape. Now, in this region that we live in, a vast majority of the land is in public trust. Agencies like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management have responsibility for resources on these lands. By law, they have to oversee cultural resources just like they have to oversee other physical resources such as timber or mining or grazing. All of these things have certain kinds of economic benefits. Now, archaeologists frequently work with federal and state agencies to do archaeology. And we do it in a variety of different ways. Any time that a manager has a project that he has to undertake, he's forced to have some idea of what kinds of resources there are out there. When a manager over here discovers that a coal lease may occur, before that lease can take place, he has to have an idea of what's going to happen to grazing leases. He has to have an idea of what's going to happen to cultural resources. But finally, the archaeologist is interested in the resource itself in a greater detail. And oftentimes, we end up in situations where resources are going to be destroyed because of particular activities. Now, examples of that were abundant during the early 1950s when dams along the Missouri River clear on into the 1960s were being constructed. And those dams inundated many archaeological sites. We can look at Oahe, at Garrison, at Fort Peck, and all of those reservoirs inundated lands that were being occupied by prehistoric people. One of the issues that we frequently are faced with is what good is archaeology? I've been asked the question many times. And it took me a long time to understand why it was an issue. And finally I realized that archaeology is not a resource in the sense that timber is a resource, or that minerals are a resource, or that grazing land is a resource, because many of us don't see the archaeology that's there. Now, archaeology is of value simply because we have to know something about our past to predict a little more reliably where we're going. A famous philosopher, George Santayana, made the comment that those who forget the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat them. And obviously, if we look at our history, we discover that there are many lessons we've learned that we would not want to relearn. Now, that's a rather esoteric sort of reason for doing archaeology. There are more pragmatic, more immediate, and certainly economic reasons for doing archaeology. Prominent among these reasons are the development of tourism and recreation. Throughout the northwestern United States, we've come to realize that recreation and tourism is a very important economic resource, and that we have not taken advantage of that resource. Within a few miles of almost any city in this region, we could readily establish either a car tour exhibit or a series of museums that would contain a variety of background information on the prehistory of the area. To this point, academicians have published their work for other academicians, and for large part, public agencies have responded by doing compliance work. That is, if we're going to destroy a site, we have to excavate it, but going no further. It's probably approaching the time that we should start thinking of these as an educational resource that allows us to learn explicitly about our past.
Most of the human past is hidden in prehistory, before it was recorded in writing. That past, in large part, has determined what we are now and what we will be in the future. Archaeology provides a piece of knowledge about human behavior that simply can't be acquired any other way. It is this knowledge that helps us know the past in order to guide the future.